The captain's voice cracked through the cabin, low and clipped. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of your seat. Now." Every sound seemed to vanish at once. No rustle of jackets, no clink of glasses, just the soft mechanical hum of the aircraft and the sudden awareness that something had gone very wrong. Charles Whitman did not move. He was standing in the aisle of the first-class cabin, shoulders squared, one hand resting lightly on the headrest of seat 2A. His other hand held a boarding pass, slightly bent at the corner from being folded and unfolded too many times in the last 10 minutes. His breathing was slow, deliberate, the kind of breathing a man learns when panic is expensive. Around him, eyes avoided his face. The woman in seat 2B stared straight ahead. Lips pressed thin knuckles white around her purse strap. A man across the aisle pretended to adjust his reading glasses, though he hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Someone farther back whispered a single word. Security. Charles could feel it before he fully understood it. That familiar tightening in the chest. Not fear. Recognition. This was how it always escalated. It had started quietly, too quietly to feel dangerous at first. 10 minutes earlier, the cabin had been bathed in soft amber light, the kind airlines use to signal comfort and calm. The smell of warmed bread drifted down the aisle. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s with perfectly set hair and a voice trained to sound endlessly patient, rolled the meal cart forward. "Chicken confit or short rib?" "Sir?" she asked the white man beside Charles, smiling as she spoke. "Short rib," he replied. The tray landed gently, silverware aligned, napkin placed just so. Then she turned to Charles, her smile faltered, not vanished, just thinned. "I'm sorry," she said, glancing at the cart, then at him. "We're out of the premium meals." Charles looked down at the empty tray table in front of him, then at the cart, then at the tray steaming inches away in his neighbor's hands. "I'm in first class," he said calmly. "Yes, but those were pre-selected," she replied. Her tone shifted barely perceptible. Less warmth, more procedure. "I can offer you something from the main cabin." He nodded once, slow. "I wasn't offered a pre-selection." A pause, a breath drawn in through her nose. "Sir, I don't want to hold up service." That was when he knew. Not suspected. Knew. Because this wasn't about chicken or short rib. It was about control. About who was expected to accept disappointment quietly, and who wasn't. Charles had spent nearly 6 decades learning the difference. He had not raised his voice, had not gestured, had not used words like unfair or discrimination. He simply asked again, softer this time. "Can you please explain why the seat next to me received a meal and I didn't?" The lead attendant's jaw tightened. "I'm going to ask you to sit back down," she said. "You're causing discomfort." Discomfort. The word hung there, absurd and heavy, like accusing a mirror of being broken because it reflected too clearly. That was when Margaret Lewis stood up. She did not rush. She rose with the measured stiffness of someone who had lived long enough to respect her knees. 67 years old, grey hair pulled into a low bun, a navy cardigan folded neatly over the arm of her seat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady, carrying farther than it needed to. I'm a retired civil rights attorney, and what you're doing right now is denying service to a paying first-class passenger without justification. The lead attendant's face flushed. Ma'am, please sit down. I will, Margaret replied after you answer his question. That was when the shift happened. The invisible line crossed. Another attendant appeared, then the purser. Then the captain was called from the cockpit. And now the captain stood there, one hand braced against the overhead bin, eyes fixed on Charles, as if he were an unexploded device. So the captain said again, louder now, "Step out of your seat." Charles finally turned. The narrator could see what others could not. The memory flickering behind his eyes. A loading dock in Detroit. A drill sergeant barking orders. A bank manager asking who really owned the account. A security guard's hand resting too close to a holster. Charles Whitman was not a man unfamiliar with authority. He was a man deeply familiar with how it was used. He stepped into the aisle. Margaret opened her mouth to speak again, but Charles lifted a single finger, not toward her, but toward the captain. One question, he said. The cabin leaned in collectively, even those pretending not to listen. Am I being removed for refusing to follow a lawful instruction, Charles asked, or for asking why I was denied a service that every other passenger in this cabin received? The captain hesitated. That hesitation mattered, because hesitation was where truth lived. The lead attendant spoke quickly, filling the gap. He was confrontational, disruptive. Margaret laughed once. Sharp. That man hasn't raised his voice the entire time. Silence again. Thick now. Charles felt the familiar burn behind his eyes. Not tears. Pressure. The cost of holding decades of restraint in a single breath. He thought of his brother gone 5 years now, who used to tell him, "You're always too calm. One day that calm's going to break you." He thought of his nephew, 12 years old, asking why grown men at the airport kept calling him Buddy instead of Sir. The camera would linger here if this were a film. On the slight tremor in Charles's hand as he folded his boarding pass. On the way, the captain's authority wavered just enough to reveal uncertainty. On Margaret's steady gaze, daring someone to lie. This was the moment before the story split. Before anyone knew who Charles Whitman really was. Before the consequences began stacking slow and inevitable. The captain cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, choosing each word carefully now. "For the moment, please return to your seat. We'll address this after landing." "After landing?" Charles nodded. "Once." He turned, slid back into seat 2A, and buckled in. The seatbelt clicked. Loud in the quiet. As the plane continued west, the meal cart rolled away. The short rib cooled untouched beside him. Margaret sat down, her knee brushing his. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. Charles stared out the window at the thick blanket of clouds below, endless and indifferent. "I know," he said. What no one in that cabin knew not yet was that this wasn't the first time Charles Whitman had been told to wait until after landing. And it wouldn't end the way it always had before. Because some men learned patience to survive, and some learned it to strike. Charles Whitman had learned long ago that silence was never empty. It carried weight. It carried memory. And on this flight, cruising west above a solid floor of cloud silence, pressed against him, harder than any accusation ever could. He sat perfectly still, hands resting on his thighs, eyes forward. Anyone watching would have thought he was calm. That was the mistake people always made. Calm was not the absence of feeling. Calm was containment. The narrator knew what his face did not show. The slow thud of his heartbeat in his ears. The faint metallic taste at the back of his tongue. The way his left knee twitched once, then stilled a habit from years spent standing at attention when standing still mattered more than comfort. Across the aisle, Margaret Lewis leaned back in her seat, arms folded, jaw tight. She kept her eyes on the closed cockpit door, not on Charles, as if looking at him too directly might make the moment more fragile than it already was. Behind them, the cabin resumed its careful imitation of normal. A flight attendant cleared an empty glass. Someone coughed. The engines hummed, steady and indifferent. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The man beside Charles, the one who had received the short rib, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced down at his plate, then sideways, then away again. Guilt, the quiet kind, settled over his features. Finally he spoke. "Sir," he said, voice low. "I don't know what that was about, but it wasn't right." Charles turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. "No," he said. "It wasn't." The man nodded, relieved not to be asked for more. That was how most people preferred it. A brief recognition. No responsibility. The lead attendant did not return to their row. Instead, a younger attendant appeared a while later, early 30s, polite, nervous energy vibrating just under the surface. His name tag read, Daniel. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" he asked Charles too carefully. "Thank you," Charles replied. Daniel hesitated, then leaned in, slightly lowering his voice. "I'm sorry about earlier." Charles studied him. The faint redness around the young man's eyes, the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. This one knew. This one felt it. "I appreciate that," Charles said. He meant it. Daniel straightened and moved on shoulders hunched, as if bracing for impact that hadn't yet come. Margaret waited until he was gone. "They sent him because they think it helps," she murmured. "Optics." Charles exhaled through his nose. "It always is." She turned to look at him now, really look. "You handled that better than most." He gave a half smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I've had her practice." The clouds outside thickened, then thinned again. Time stretched. As the cabin lights dimmed, Charles's thoughts drifted backward, pulled by a gravity he no longer resisted. Cleveland. His father's hands cracked and darkened from years in the mill. His mother counting out bills at the kitchen table, whispering numbers like prayers. The day he learned at 14 that being right and being safe were not the same thing. He remembered his first job after the army. Midwestern Freight Company. Windowless office. He had been 33, freshly promoted, managing a region that had never been managed by someone who looked like him. A driver had laughed in his face when Charles introduced himself as his supervisor. Another had asked when the real boss was coming. Charles had smiled then too. He always smiled at first. That memory carried weight now, sitting 37,000 feet above the country that taught him restraint before it taught him pride. Margaret shifted beside him. "You ever notice," she said quietly, How quickly inconvenience becomes disruption when the wrong person speaks. He glanced at her. Every time. She nodded, lips pressed together. I argued cases like this for decades. Airports, trains, hotels. Always the same script. Deny. Minimize. Flip the narrative. Make the person asking for fairness the problem. Charles looked forward again. Did it ever get easier? Margaret considered that. No, she said. But it got clearer. The captain did not return. No announcement followed. No apology. The message was unmistakable. Wait. Sit. Be grateful the situation had not gone further. That was when Charles reached into his briefcase. He did it slowly, deliberately, as if retrieving a document of no particular importance. Inside the leather case, worn smooth at the corners, sat a thin black notebook. Unmarked. No label. He rested it on his lap and opened it. The pages were filled with tight, careful handwriting. Dates, locations, airlines, names, brief descriptions. Not anger, not commentary. Just facts. Margaret noticed and raised an eyebrow. He met her gaze. I don't do this because I expect justice, he said, softly. I do it because memory fades, and systems depend on that. She studied the notebook, then him. Something like respect settled in her eyes. That's how you survive long enough to matter. Charles wrote a single line. The pen did not shake. Flight, Chicago to Phoenix. First class. Meal denied. Escalation. Captain involvement. Witness present. He closed the notebook and returned it to the briefcase. The young attendant, Daniel, passed again this time, without stopping. His eyes flicked toward Charles, then away. Fear lived there now. Not of Charles. Of what came next. 2 rows back, a woman whispered something to her partner. Phones remained tucked away, but the tension had not fully dissolved. It lingered electric, as if everyone sensed they had witnessed the beginning of something, not the end. The plane began its descent an hour later. The captain's voice returned smooth and practiced, thanking passengers for choosing the airline. Charles almost smiled at the irony. Almost. Margaret leaned closer. They're going to try to close this quietly, she said. They always do. Yes, Charles replied. They will. She waited, sensing there was more. And that he added after a beat is where they usually make their mistake. The wheels touched down with a jolt that traveled up through the cabin floor and into Charles's bones. The seatbelt sign chimed. People stood, stretching, reclaiming their belongings and their patience. The lead attendant positioned herself near the exit face, carefully composed. Professional. Pleasant. As passengers filed past, she offered polite smiles that did not reach her eyes. When Charles stood, the captain appeared again, blocking the aisle. Sir, he said quietly, so only they could hear. We'd like to discuss what happened. Charles looked at him. Really looked. At the man's creased uniform. The fatigue behind authority. The calculation. Of course, Charles said. After everyone deplanes. Margaret stepped up beside him, uninvited and unmovable. I'll be present, she said. The captain hesitated, then nodded. He had already lost control of the narrative. He just didn't know how badly yet. As the last passenger passed, the cabin felt suddenly smaller. Stripped of witnesses, stripped of noise. The lead attendant crossed her arms. "This didn't need to happen," she said, frustration leaking through. Charles met her gaze. His voice was calm, level. "You're right," he said. "It didn't." She frowned, uncertain why the words unsettled her more than anger would have. Margaret glanced between them, then down at her watch. "You might want to call your supervisor," she said mildly. "And your legal department." The lead attendant scoffed. "For a meal mix-up." Charles picked up his briefcase. "For what comes next," he said. And for the first time since the flight began, something like doubt flickered across her face. Charles Whitman walked down the jet bridge with a calm so complete it was almost audible. Every step measured, deliberate. Security officers flanking him on either side looked uneasy, not because he had threatened them, but because he radiated a confidence that made them question the authority they had been trained to wield. The corridor was long fluorescent lights overhead, slicing the shadows, turning every polished surface into a reflection of the man they thought they controlled. He paused just outside the terminal doors. The evening air carried the faint scent of gasoline coffee, and the city, a city that had watched him grow from a boy in Cleveland neighborhoods into the CEO of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. He could feel the weight of years of every slight, every disbelief he had endured, pressing against the calm exterior. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, the subtle sheen of his watch catching the light, a quiet reminder of power he had built quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. Inside the terminal, the crowd flowed around him like a river against an immovable stone. Travelers rushed rolling suitcases, clattering against tile. Flight announcements bounced from speakers overhead. But none of it registered. He had only one thought: the next steps had to be perfect, precise, unassailable. One misstep and the narrative would be twisted against him, the incident reduced to angry passenger dispute. His phone buzzed. He did not answer immediately. The screen displayed a text from his assistant, Emily Parker. "Board aware. Legal team on standby. Proceeding as discussed." He nodded a small, almost imperceptible motion, confirming what she already knew. Every piece of his team was in position, every contingency accounted for. The airport security officer glanced at him again. Subtle hesitation in her stance. She was young, barely 25, and clearly questioning whether the passenger in front of her was truly disruptive or something far more formidable. Charles did not look at her. He did not need to. His presence alone spoke volumes. Inside the waiting area, a man seated near the gate tapped on his tablet, nervously glancing up at Charles every few seconds. He was one of the airline's operational managers, summoned at the first hint of disruption. His shoulders were tight, jaw clenched. He had been trained for emergencies, for passenger complaints. He had not been trained for someone who had decades of experience, turning minor indignities into leverage. Not for someone who could make him accountable in ways that extended far beyond the terminal. Emily appeared at his side, quiet as a shadow. She handed him a folder, flight logs, witness statements, the lead attendant's notes, previous complaints. He flipped through them, scanning with the speed of someone who had memorized protocols, regulations, and loopholes over decades. Every incident matched a pattern he had been tracking for months. The airline had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. A woman nearby in her early 60s approached discreetly. She introduced herself as Linda Thompson, a retired airline attorney who had followed Charles's previous work on corporate compliance and civil rights. "Mr. Whitman," she said softly. They've handled you wrong. But you have leverage they will not see coming. Her eyes were sharp, not afraid, not awed, simply analytical. Charles nodded, scanning the terminal for the final member of his advance. A young man, 28, his legal intern, James Reynolds, was moving toward them, carrying additional documentation contracts, shareholder reports, communications with federal regulators. Every document meticulously prepared, ready to be deployed at the exact right moment. They're calling it a minor incident, Linda continued, her voice low. They don't know yet that it's systemic. That's your advantage. Charles allowed a faint smile, barely visible. He had waited for this longer than anyone could imagine. This was not about revenge. Not really. It was about accountability. About proving that systems designed to protect power often failed to protect fairness. And now the moment had arrived. Minutes later, the airline's regional manager appeared, followed by the head of customer service. They looked confident, masked, smiling in a way that was meant to project control. Charles watched them approach, noting the micro-expressions, the tightness around the eyes, the fraction of hesitation at the first acknowledgement. They believed they were in command. They did not know the truth of the man before them. Mr. Whitman, the regional manager, said, voice loud enough to carry across the quiet of the area. We understand there was a misunderstanding aboard Flight 329. Perhaps we can resolve this quickly. He gestured vaguely, an invitation disguised as civility. Charles did not respond immediately. He let the words hang. The pause was deliberate, like a chess player waiting for the opponent to make a revealing move. He then opened the folder, spreading the documentation across a nearby counter-flight logs, recorded statements, previous reports of discriminatory service time stamps aligning perfectly. Every detail verifiable, undeniable. The manager's smile faltered. He leaned in slightly, trying to mask it. I see you've brought quite a file, he said. We can certainly review. Charles cut him off with a steady, controlled voice. You can review. But first, understand this. This is not about a single meal, a single seat, or even a single flight. This is about how your employees treated me, how your systems allowed it, and how quickly you attempt to dismiss accountability. Every word precise, every syllable carrying the authority of experience and preparation. A small crowd had gathered. Passengers waiting for other flights, airport staff, even security personnel. No one spoke, but eyes darted toward the unfolding confrontation. Phones subtly rose. A young woman near the coffee kiosk discreetly began recording her movements, careful, unobtrusive. The manager glanced at the lead attendant, who was standing a few steps behind, arms folded, face pale. She had believed she could handle the situation. She had not considered the magnitude of what Charles had orchestrated. Charles leaned slightly forward, fingers brushing the edge of the folder. I have every report, every witness, every video, all ready to be submitted to corporate compliance, the Federal Aviation Authority, and any civil rights body necessary. You may think this is a small inconvenience, but it is in fact a test, and you are failing it. The manager swallowed. His confidence wavered. The lead attendant took a step back, aware that her earlier assurances of control were now meaningless. Charles continued. I will allow you the opportunity to address this before it escalates. That opportunity ends the moment I step into my office, review my team's recommendations, and make a decision on how to proceed. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and unflinching. That decision will have consequences, financial, operational, and reputational. Consequences for the company, for its executives, and for the individuals responsible for this incident. Emily stood quietly to his right, holding her tablet open, ready to present additional documentation. Linda adjusted her stance, subtly projecting authority without drawing attention. James remained at the back, ready to log every interaction, every word, every expression. The manager exhaled slowly. We had no idea you would take this seriously," he said. Charles tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Seriousness is measured not by intention, but by action. And the question you must now ask yourself is, will you act or will you be acted upon?" A ripple of unease spread across the crowd. Passengers whispered to one another, some craning to see the documents, others exchanging glances that said, "This is far bigger than a seating issue." Even the security officers stiffened, realizing that the man before them was not merely a passenger to be escorted. He was a storm contained within a suit, controlled yet inexorably powerful. A young boy waiting with his mother near the gates tilted his head up. "Mom, is he in trouble?" she asked softly. The mother shook her head, uncertain, but even she could feel the gravity of the moment. The eyes, the documents, the stillness of Charles. Everything demanded acknowledgement. The manager spoke again, more carefully. "Mr. Whitman, what exactly are you asking us to do?" He sounded professional, but there was a tremor of uncertainty. Charles closed the folder. The finality of the gesture was theatrical, yet inevitable. "You will review the conduct of your staff, acknowledge the failures in your systems, and prepare to make amends for the ways your processes failed me, and any other customer subjected to similar treatment. Failure to do so will leave me no choice but to escalate, and when I escalate, the full weight of scrutiny falls where it belongs." The manager nodded slowly, but his eyes were not confident. His hands fidgeted with his ID badge. The lead attendant stepped forward silently, attempting to assert control, but Charles's presence did not permit it. Every inch of space he occupied, every breath, every blink, reminded them that authority could no longer be assumed. It had to be earned or endured. Margaret leaned over, whispering into Charles's ear, "They underestimate you. They always do." He allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. "And that, my friend, is where advantage begins." The terminal remained hushed. Flight boards, announcements, distant rolling suitcases sound existed, but none penetrated the tension that had settled thick and unyielding around Charles Whitman and the people who had thought a meal could define power. Somewhere in the back, a security officer adjusted her headset, glancing toward the monitors, noticing the recordings, noticing the witnesses. Realization dawned that the event was no longer contained to a single gate, a single corridor. This was now a convergence of authority, accountability, and anticipation. And Charles Whitman, silent, resolute, collected his briefcase, ready to transform patience into action. The next phase was imminent. The taxiway stretched ahead, wet from an earlier drizzle, reflecting the terminal lights in fractured patterns across the asphalt. Charles Whitman stepped into the sleek black SUV waiting curbside, the driver nodding quietly, not needing instructions. His hands rested on the leather armrest, long fingers drumming lightly, each tap precise, controlled. Nothing about this ride was casual. The tension from the gate had not yet left him. It had transformed into anticipation. Emily Parker slid into the seat beside him, tablet open. "All systems ready?" she asked, voice low, clipped. Charles didn't answer immediately. He watched the reflection of the runway in the tinted window, the planes lined up, engines humming softly. "Everything is ready," he said finally. "But timing is critical. They need to think they have control. We will let them feel that for just a moment longer." Outside the city moved oblivious. Taxis honked, travelers rushed with wheeled suitcases, business people on phones arguing deals. Inside the SUV, every sound felt muted, measured. Margaret Lewis sat in the back, her hands folded over a worn briefcase, eyes scanning every movement, calculating, remembering decades of watching injustice ignored until it became undeniable. She glanced at Charles. "Do you want me to handle the introductions?" she asked. He shook his head slightly. "Let them underestimate me a little more. Let them believe it's routine." In the passenger lounge, the airline executives were waiting unaware of the storm approaching. The regional manager, mid-40s, neatly pressed suit, adjusted his tie for the third time, attempting a composure he didn't feel. Beside him, the head of operations rubbed the bridge of his nose. Both had been briefed on a passenger complaint, nothing more. Not a CEO. Not someone who had spent years learning to turn minor indignities into leverage, and who now carried that knowledge into their lobby, like a weapon disguised as patience. The SUV pulled up to the curb. Charles didn't hurry. He exited walking slowly, letting the length of his stride communicate authority. Security officers flanked him, scanning the crowd. They did not know who he was. Not yet. To them, he was a passenger, one who had caused an incident, one who might be belligerent. He was none of those things. His calm alone unbalanced the expectations they had been trained to enforce. Inside the lounge, murmurs arose as he entered. He was tall, broad-shouldered face, lined with experience but not age. Grey at the temples, hair cropped close, sharp eyes that measured more than a glance should ever capture. The executives turned briefly, startled. They had expected a minor escalation, a flustered passenger. Not him. Not the man whose company controlled a significant portion of the airline's logistical consulting, whose contracts touched operations they had always considered untouchable. "Mr. Whitman," the regional manager began, voice practiced. "We appreciate you coming down to—" Charles held up a hand. "Let's dispense with pleasantries." His voice was low but carried. The kind of voice that could cut through ambient noise and still hold weight. "I am aware of how you handled the flight, and I am aware of how your staff presented it to you. I am here to ensure that it does not happen again. But I am not here to negotiate in good faith unless the facts are clear." The executives exchanged quick glances. The head of operations spoke first. "Sir, we understand there was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding implies error." Charles interrupted. "This was not error. It was a decision. A choice made by individuals and enabled by your systems. That choice has consequences." Margaret stepped forward. "And those consequences will be documented," she added. "I have already verified that every incident, every witness, every timestamp aligns perfectly with the records on file. You cannot claim ignorance. The regional manager's hand twitched toward a folder on the table. We have preliminary reports. I have video evidence, Charles said, leaning slightly forward, letting the slight shift in weight signal intent. I have witness statements. I have corroboration from passengers from your staff, from the legal framework governing airline operations. And I have a timeline of your internal failures that spans more than 6 months. A young assistant placed a thin laptop on the table. Charles opened it deliberately, the screen facing them. A slideshow of dates, names, emails, and video stills filled the screen. Each frame precise. Each frame undeniable. The executive's confident facade began to crack. Eyes widened, then darted to one another. They had expected a complaint. They had not expected a case file built with this level of detail, sophistication, and premeditation. Charles's gaze swept the room, landing on the lead executive who had made the initial call to remove him from the seat. You instructed your staff, he said calmly, to deny service. You allowed them to escalate to the point of threatening removal. You misrepresented facts to justify that escalation. Every choice you made compounded the original injustice. The man shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie, clearing his throat. Mr. Whitman, we were following procedure. Procedure does not excuse wrongdoing. Charles said each word deliberate, slicing through the air. And procedure in your hands has a limit. That limit is accountability. Today you have crossed it. Margaret handed him a small folder. This includes your communications with federal regulators, copies of contracts indicating your company's involvement in operational oversight, and the financial leverage you hold in the parent company. Everything they think is confidential. Everything they think is routine. It isn't. The assistant chimed in. These documents have been cross-verified. Any attempt to dispute the authenticity can be immediately verified by external counsel. The room grew tense. The hum of the terminal outside seemed distant. The executive's polished calm had begun to unravel, replaced by subtle panic. The regional manager leaned forward. Sir, we can discuss reparations. We can. Charles shook his head, slow, methodical. Reparations are insufficient. Apologies are insufficient. The staff involved must be held accountable. Your internal policies must be reviewed, corrected, and verified by independent oversight, and you will begin preparing a compensation plan for affected passengers. Not because I demand it, because your failure to do so will be public, unavoidable, and total. The lead executive's hand gripped the edge of the table. His pulse quickened. He had thought he had controlled every scenario, every option, every exit. He had not considered the man in front of him. The calm contained deliberate force of decades spent learning to convert minor indignities into leverage that no one could ignore. Are you threatening us? He asked finally, voice tight. Charles leaned back, folding his hands over the briefcase on his lap. I am informing you of reality. Threats are unnecessary when the facts speak for themselves. You have a choice: act responsibly now or watch as the consequences unfold beyond anything you imagined. Every regulator, every press outlet, every civil rights organization, all will see precisely what has occurred. Margaret added softly but firmly, and you will not be able to hide behind policy. The pattern, The documentation, the witnesses, everything is in place. The executives absorbed the weight of it. The room was silent save for the low murmur of air conditioning. The terminal noise outside intruded faintly, but it felt irrelevant. Charles had made the space his own. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a force of accountability made manifest. Finally, the youngest of the executive team spoke almost under his breath. We didn't realize we didn't." Charles's eyes met his, cold, measured, unyielding. "Realization is irrelevant. Action is necessary. You now decide whether you will meet the standard expected of those entrusted with authority or whether you will continue enabling behavior that is indefensible, undeniable, and now irrevocably documented." A bead of sweat formed at the temple of the lead executive. He glanced at the others. No one could offer a solution, a word, to diminish what had been revealed. The decision had already been made, even if they had not yet spoken it aloud. Charles gathered the folder and closed it with a soft snap. He did not rise. He did not move. Every inch of him radiated control, precision, and inevitability. Margaret and Emily flanked him silently. The assistants remained ready. All preparations complete. Outside, passengers waited unaware that their flight had become the epicenter of corporate accountability, that the next steps would determine who retained authority and who faced consequences. Every person in that lounge could feel it, even if they did not yet understand. Charles's eyes swept the room once more. The calm, deliberate weight of his presence was itself a message. Mistakes would be punished. Failures would be visible, and justice long delayed would not be denied. The executives could no longer pretend. The game had stood changed. And Charles Whitman, who had endured every slight, every disbelief, every indignity, remained perfectly still, waiting for the first move. The conference room overlooked the city skyline, a grid of lights stretching into the darkness like a map of possibilities. Charles Whitman entered last, slow, deliberate, the subtle click of his polished shoes on the marble floor, marking each step as though it were a sentence in a verdict. Emily Parker followed, carrying a tablet and a folder, each containing layers of documentation. Margaret Lewis brought up the rear, her posture impeccable, eyes sweeping the room for any sign of pretense or weakness. The executives were already seated around the long oak table faces, masked with practiced neutrality. Papers were arranged, laptops, open pens poised. They believed themselves prepared. They were not. Charles placed his briefcase on the table, flipped it open, and let it sit for a moment. Silence stretched. The weight of anticipation pressed down like a physical presence. He did not rush. He did not explain. He let them feel the room, the space, the inevitability. The first to speak was the regional manager. "Mr. Whitman, thank you for coming. We believe we can." "Stop," Charles said, calm but unyielding. The word landed like a gavel. "Do not start with thanks or politeness. That is irrelevant. We are here to correct failures, not exchange niceties." His eyes swept the table. "You know why I am here, and yet I am sure you believe that polite phrases can mask what occurred. They cannot." The lead executive leaned forward. "We have reviewed preliminary reports. We are ready to take corrective action." Charles raised a hand, slow, deliberate. "Preliminary is not sufficient. Reports are only as truthful as the perspective of those who write them. I have first-hand accounts, time stamps, video, and multiple witness statements. Your preliminary reports attempt to rewrite history. They are inadequate. A young analyst at the far end shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at his laptop, then back at Charles. The room held its breath. Margaret Lewis spoke, then, voice low, precise. We have verified every claim. Every record aligns with Mr. Whitman's documentation. Any attempt to claim misunderstanding will be met with evidence. The executives' composed facades began to crumble. One of them, the operations director, adjusted his tie, blinked rapidly. He had expected a complaint, a grievance, perhaps, an apology. Not this meticulous display of facts, not a presentation designed to corner them with undeniable proof. Charles opened the tablet Emily had placed before him. Slide after slide displayed emails, flight logs, internal communications. Each frame a precise illustration of repeated failure directives, ignored policy misapplied, passengers treated inequitably. The patterns were evident, the scope undeniable. This, Charles said, tapping the screen lightly, is not about me alone. About me. It is about the system you allow to persist, and it is about the consequences that come when that system is exposed to scrutiny it cannot evade. The regional manager leaned back, exhaling through the nose. We are prepared to... Prepared. Charles interrupted, voice rising just enough to cut through the tension. Not anger, but authority. You are not prepared. You were prepared to handle a complaint. You were not prepared to face accountability. You were prepared to dismiss, to delay, to rationalize. None of that is sufficient now. A woman seated near the head of the table, head of corporate compliance, tapped her pen against the table. Mr. Whitman, what exactly do you want from us? Specific actions. Charles leaned forward, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. Yes. Specific. First, the employees who denied service and misrepresented facts must be held accountable. Discipline must be immediate, not delayed, not framed as an investigation for appearance's sake. Immediate. A man, legal counsel, scribbled notes, frantically muttering under his breath. He knew the legal ramifications would be severe if Charles moved forward. Second, Charles continued, a full review of your systems must be conducted. Independent oversight, transparency. Any failure to comply will be public. Any attempt to suppress facts will be documented and exposed. Third, compensation must be considered for passengers affected by these repeated failures. Not for me. For them. Margaret added quietly, We have calculated the range of affected passengers, the documentation and the appropriate channels. It is ready for submission to the regulators and public agencies if necessary. The room was quiet, each executive weighing the implications. For decades they had navigated corporate risk with calculated measures, but this was beyond measures. This was strategy applied with precision, morality with leverage. Charles allowed himself a brief glance at the city beyond the glass. Somewhere below, the streets moved like veins through a living organism. Decisions here would ripple outward. They would touch reputations, market confidence, investor trust. They would change the calculus of risk for the airline in ways these executives had never considered. The operations director cleared his throat. We will comply with the disciplinary measures for the staff involved, of course, and we can initiate a review of procedures. Charles's eyes snapped to him. Procedures are meaningless without accountability. Policies without consequences are instructions written in sand. Your actions or inactions have already proven that. If you do not enforce real consequences, do not bother drafting policies. The world will see the difference between words and action. Emily handed him a new file. Evidence from passengers who recorded independently. Witness statements corroborating behavior. Charles flipped through a few pages, nodding. Every statement aligned. Every timestamp verified. The chain of events was airtight. One of the executives, younger, anxious, whispered, This is more than a complaint." "Yes," Charles replied softly, but with a weight that made the words settle like concrete. "It is an accusation. It is a test of integrity, and it is a chance to correct what you have allowed to fester unnoticed." Margaret leaned forward, voice firm. "Ignoring this will not erase it. Public scrutiny will follow. Media regulators, civil rights organizations, all will have access to the documentation. Any delay will be interpreted as complicity." The head of compliance shifted in her seat, pale. "We did not anticipate this scale." "The documentation, the preparation," Charles interrupted again. "Preparation is a necessity when systems fail. What you call scale, I call proof. And it is convincing proof backed by strategy and patience, not emotion. That is why I am here. Not for apology. Not for restitution. But for action that matters." A low murmur ran through the room. The executives whispered among themselves, realizing they were no longer negotiating a minor dispute. They were being measured against the standard of accountability, against a man who had spent decades learning the architecture of leverage, the application of law, and the orchestration of consequence. The operations director spoke again, voice tighter. "Mr. Whitman, if we comply, can this be resolved quietly?" Charles let the question linger. He could feel the room holding its collective breath. "Quiet resolution is impossible," he said. "When wrongdoing is systemic and documented, it cannot remain hidden. You may choose to act responsibly. You may choose to delay, deny, or minimize. Those are your options. The consequences of each are clear, and the world is watching." The regional manager exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "And if we act immediately?" Charles leaned back slightly. Fingers interlaced over the folder. "Then you begin to restore trust. You demonstrate that authority is not arbitrary, that privilege does not protect misconduct, that responsibility matters. That is the only way forward." Margaret tapped her pen against the table. "And there will be witnesses," she added. "Every action, every decision, every step. It will be recorded, documented, and evaluated independently. You cannot evade accountability through position or procedure." The youngest assistant whispered something to his neighbor. "This is bigger than anything I've seen in corporate disputes." Charles's gaze swept the room again. Sharp, calm, commanding. "Yes, it is bigger. Because it is about more than a seat, more than a meal. It is about whether systems designed to serve people can be trusted to protect fairness. It is about whether those entrusted with authority will act ethically when challenged." A pause. The room was tense. No one moved. Every breath was measured, every thought weighed. The implication was clear. The decisions they made tonight would ripple through the company, the industry, and beyond. Charles closed the folder gently, the soft snap echoing in the quiet room like a punctuation mark. You have what you need. The rest is yours to decide. I will wait for the actions, not the words. Margaret exhaled softly. Emily gave him a subtle nod. The executives remained frozen, each processing the enormity of the confrontation, the precision of the evidence, the inevitability of accountability. Outside the conference room, the city lights twinkled like a grid of possibilities. Inside, one man had turned patience into strategy, indignity into leverage, and observation into power. And as the night deepened, every move, every choice, every silence in that room would be measured against the standard he had quietly set. Charles Whitman leaned back in his office chair. The city sprawled below in a glittering web of lights that felt simultaneously distant and urgent. The hum of the air conditioning mingled with the low buzz of the city. Each sound a reminder that time moved relentlessly, indifferent. To outrage, to strategy, or to justice. He picked up the phone, feeling its cool weight in his hand, and let it rest there for a moment, savoring the pause before action. Emily Parker hovered nearby. Tablet in hand, every eye on the screens that displayed timelines, emails, and security camera stills from the flight. They've been reviewing the documents all afternoon, she said quietly. Corporate counsel hasn't responded yet, but their hesitation is clear. Charles nodded without speaking. He did not need words to read the tension in the room. Hesitation was already a victory in itself. Margaret Lewis sat across the desk, fingers intertwined over her briefcase. They don't realize, she murmured, how exposed they are. They think this is a minor issue because it's framed as a passenger complaint. They have no idea it touches every level of operational authority. Charles' eyes narrowed. They will soon. He tapped the desk twice, slow, deliberate. We've given them time to think. Now we escalate strategically. The phone rang sharp, insistent. He picked it up with measured calm. Charles, the voice on the other end, said clipped professional. It was Thomas Reynolds, CEO of the parent company. I've reviewed your submission. The scope of this documentation is substantial. Can we discuss? Yes, Charles said. But only in person. This requires full transparency and accountability. I will not negotiate behind closed doors with misrepresentations. A pause. Understood. We will arrange a meeting in 24 hours. Charles replaced the receiver slowly. He leaned back and let his gaze drift to the skyline again, reflecting on the steps that had brought him here. He thought of the subtle humiliations, the microaggressions, the deliberate slights that had accumulated into this single, tangible episode of injustice. And he knew that if he acted now decisively, he could force change not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or erased by systems built to favor compliance over fairness. Emily tapped her tablet, pulling up a map of the airline's corporate structure. Their network is vast, she said. Multiple subsidiaries overlapping chains of command, every flight crew accountable to at least 3 levels of management. If we proceed, we need precise timing. Charles nodded. We hit the nodes that matter first. Start with the operational oversight, then corporate compliance, then PR. Everyone else will follow once the pattern is established. and document every interaction, every hesitation, every word. Margaret leaned forward, eyes bright with anticipation. And the media strategy? Charles allowed a brief smile. We don't release it yet. The story is too fragile and too powerful to mishandle. We control the narrative by controlling the facts and the timing. The moment it reaches the public, it must be unassailable, indisputable. That is when leverage becomes action. He moved to the sideboard, pouring himself a glass of water, then pausing as the light caught the edge of a framed photograph, a young Charles, standing beside his father at a factory in Cleveland. Sleeves rolled, eyes set on some horizon only he could see. A reminder. Patience, endurance, and preparation had always been his strongest allies. The door opened, and a junior associate, barely 27, stepped inside with a tablet in hand. So the flight attendants involved have been placed on administrative leave pending review, he reported. Security footage has been collated, and multiple witnesses are prepared to provide statements. But the executives at corporate headquarters are resisting acknowledgement of systemic failure. Charles allowed a measured exhale. Expected. Resistance is always first instinct, but their hesitance can be used. We apply pressure in increments, expose the pattern, then force accountability. He looked at the tablet scanning faces, timestamps, emails. Every piece aligned perfectly. Have the legal drafts ready. I want the communication lines prepared for every scenario denial, partial acknowledgement, and full compliance. Each must be addressed immediately, with clarity and consequence. Margaret's eyes flicked to him. You intend to take this public? Yes, he said. But not yet. Timing is everything. The revelation must be unavoidable, but controlled. By the time they understand, the public will already have evidence they cannot refute, and the internal fallout will be irreversible. Emily nodded, tapping on her tablet. I've coordinated with civil rights organizations. They are ready to step in, verify documentation, and provide oversight if necessary. Good, Charles replied. This is not theater. This is not personal vendetta. This is systemic accountability. Every step must reflect that principle. No emotion, no theatrics. Precision. He walked to the window, hands resting lightly on the sill. Below, the city moved like a living organism, unaware of the machinations occurring above its streets. He thought of passengers, of employees, of all those who had faced injustice quietly, who had been dismissed, overlooked, or shamed. This was not just about a denied meal or a first-class seat. This was about creating a precedent, showing that privilege and authority did not grant immunity from accountability. A soft knock interrupted his reflection. Emily held up another tablet. Sir, I've received preliminary responses from the airline's board. They're panicking. Their legal counsel is urging delay, but the evidence has been circulated internally. They cannot suppress it without acknowledging exposure. Charles considered this. A slow, deliberate smile crossed his face. Then we move forward. Prepare the briefing for the press. Draft statements for corporate channels. Assemble witnesses. I want everything ready before their first meeting tomorrow. We will strike decisively, not recklessly, but with unmistakable authority. Margaret leaned back, arms folded. They think you're angry. They do not realize you're calculating. Yes, Charles said. Anger is a tool for the unprepared. Strategy is a tool for those who understand consequences. He picked up his glass of water, letting it rest against his lips for a moment. This is the point where power shifts, where preparation meets opportunity, where the narrative is no longer theirs to control. A soft ping from his laptop announced incoming emails. He ignored them, allowing the moment to stretch the gravity of the next 24 hours to settle over everyone in the room. Each breath was deliberate, each heartbeat measured. Every plan, every document, every witness aligned in perfect order. Emily stepped closer. "Sir, should we alert the media contacts in advance?" Charles shook his head. "Not yet. Let them think we are waiting. Let them believe they can manage the fallout. That illusion is part of the leverage. When they realize it's unavoidable, the response will be total and fair." Margaret's fingers tapped against the table. "Do you anticipate retaliation?" Charles' eyes flicked to hers, calm, unwavering. "I anticipate fear. Fear is predictable, and fear is useful. But it will not deter me. Not now. Not ever." He opened his briefcase again, reviewing the evidence one last time. Flight logs, passenger statements, video clips, email chains. Financial documentation. Every detail, precise, every link verified. This was no accident, no coincidence. This was the accumulation of decades of preparation and patience. Finally he stood, hands resting on the edge of the desk, eyes scanning the skyline one last time. The city stretched endlessly indifferent. But inside this room, in these moments, consequences were being set into motion. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, voice steady. "Commanding, we move from observation to action. Every choice, every hesitation, every misstep on their part will be met with clarity, precision, and consequence. And when it is done, the world will understand that authority is never absolute, that privilege is never unchecked, and that accountability is inevitable." Margaret and Emily exchanged a glance. The weight of the moment pressed down on them. This was no longer about a passenger complaint. This was about changing the system irrevocably before it had a chance to deny fairness again. Charles closed the briefcase gently, the soft snap reverberating in the quiet office like the signal of a starting gun. Outside, the city lights glimmered. Inside, a plan was in motion that would shake not just the airline, but the assumptions about power, privilege, and justice in the spaces people believed they controlled. And Charles Whitman, composed, deliberate, unyielding, would see it through. The morning sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the airline's headquarters, catching the glass and steel of the lobby in sharp, clean lines. Charles Whitman entered the building with measured steps, each one deliberate, his polished shoes clicking against the tile with a rhythm that seemed to command attention without a word. Emily and Margaret followed closely, silent sentinels of preparation, eyes scanning recording, absorbing the tension that vibrated through the air. Executives were already gathered in the conference room, the same faces from the terminal the night before, but with more apprehension now. They had had hours to imagine consequences, to rationalize, to panic quietly behind their closed doors. But anticipation was not action, and Charles understood exactly how to turn expectation into leverage. "Good morning," he said, voice low but firm, carrying the weight of authority accumulated over decades. "I trust everyone has reviewed the materials I provided." The regional manager nodded quickly, clearing his throat. Yes, Mr. Whitman. We have reviewed your documentation and the evidence submitted. We understand the gravity of the situation. Charles did not respond immediately. He scanned the room, noting micro-expressions, tightening of lips, flickers of uncertainty, the way one executive's hand hovered over a pen like a lifeline. Each detail mattered, each hesitation a crack to be exploited strategically. Let's dispense with pleasantries, Charles said finally. What happened on Flight 329 was not a misunderstanding. It was a series of deliberate decisions made by your staff, enabled by systemic failures in oversight. Those decisions have consequences. You may respond with words, but they are insufficient. You may respond with small gestures, but they are meaningless without action. The head of operations shifted uncomfortably. We did not anticipate the scope, Mr. Whitman. The situation escalated quickly. Charles allowed a slow, deliberate pause. Scope is measured by impact, not intent. And the impact here is clear. I have video evidence, witness statements, timestamps, communications. You can argue semantics, you can argue perception, but you cannot argue fact. The fact is that passengers were treated differently based on factors entirely unrelated to their status, their behavior, or their tickets. That is indisputable. A young analyst near the back leaned forward, whispering to his neighbor. Margaret caught it and gave a subtle nod. These were the observers who would corroborate, later silently. Mr. Whitman, the lead executive, said cautiously, "We are prepared to make adjustments, disciplinary measures for the staff involved, and an internal review of procedures." Charles's eyes narrowed. Adjustments are not accountability. Discipline delayed is discipline denied. Procedures reviewed without enforcement are useless. If you proceed with this half measure, you will demonstrate that authority exists to protect reputation, not fairness. And that will be public. The moment you attempt to minimize, deny, or delay the evidence I have compiled will be released. Regulators, media, civil rights organizations, all will have access. The room fell silent. The weight of inevitability pressed down. Even the operations director, confident in procedural knowledge, felt a tremor of unease. They had thought this was a minor issue. They had not anticipated that the passenger they dismissed would orchestrate a confrontation with such precision. Emily tapped the tablet beside Charles, bringing up charts and documents cross-referenced with internal communications. "We've mapped every point of failure," she said. Flight logs, staff schedules, prior complaints, email chains all align with the patterns outlined. Any attempt to contest this will require public admission. Margaret added, "And every witness, including passengers, is prepared to provide testimony. The narrative cannot be rewritten." Charles leaned forward slightly, letting the movement carry authority. "You will not try to rewrite it. Not today. Not tomorrow. Every action, every hesitation, every misstatement will be recorded. Your choice is simple: act responsibly and transparently, or allow the consequences to define the narrative for you." The lead executive swallowed, trying to maintain composure. "And what would you consider responsible action?" Charles lifted his hands, fingers lightly tapping the folder. "Immediate accountability for the individuals involved. Comprehensive review of systems that allowed this to occur. Transparent reporting to internal oversight and public regulators. compensation for affected passengers, and independent oversight to ensure recurrence does not happen. Anything less is insufficient. A murmur ran through the room. They had thought he was angry, but the calm, deliberate cadence of his voice carried more power than any outburst. The clarity of purpose, the meticulous preparation, the sheer certainty, it was disarming. The operations director spoke voice tight. "Mr. Whitman, the financial implications." Charles interrupted smoothly. "Yes. You are beginning to understand. Authority comes with responsibility. Avoiding accountability now may protect short-term profit, but it will erode trust reputation and regulatory compliance. That is the cost. Consider it carefully. Every hesitation, every obfuscation will cost you more than immediate, transparent action." A young assistant, Emily's colleague, typed furiously on a tablet, logging reactions, recording statements. Charles noticed and allowed a brief nod. Every move documented, every ripple traced. By the time the board reconciled the facts, they would find themselves unable to claim ignorance. The lead executive cleared his throat. "We will comply with immediate discipline and begin review procedures." Charles's eyes cut to him. Discipline is meaningless without consequence. You are not disciplining paper. You are addressing real behavior, systemic failure, and public accountability. Half measures are not acceptable. I want confirmation that these actions will be enforceable and verifiable, and that independent oversight is in place to monitor compliance. Only then will the situation be considered addressed. The room grew tense. Everyone was measuring the weight of the man before them. Every word he spoke carried implications far beyond a single flight, a single crew. This was now about institutional integrity, corporate accountability, and the assurance that fairness could not be ignored. Margaret leaned in, voice quiet but cutting. "They may attempt to argue that these demands are excessive, that they are beyond standard practice, but you have leverage they cannot ignore. The public regulators and documentation are aligned. Any misstep on their part will be undeniable." Charles nodded slightly. "Exactly. Authority is only as strong as the willingness to uphold standards, and now they must decide if they will meet the standard or be defined by its failure." The regional manager exhaled, realizing the room was no longer negotiating a simple correction. It was facing exposure, legal, financial, operational, and reputational consequences all at once. "Mr. Whitman," he said, finally, voice tight, "if we act as you suggest, can this be contained internally?" Charles allowed a slow, deliberate smile. Containment is a choice, but truth cannot be contained. It will emerge. You can choose to act responsibly and guide the narrative, or delay and watch the narrative take control of you. That is your decision. Emily tapped the tablet again. "I've coordinated with external oversight, legal counsel, and civil rights organizations. They are ready to verify compliance. They will ensure that all actions are transparent, timely, and enforceable." Charles let his gaze drift to the skyline again. Transparency is not optional, nor is consequence. Anything less renders all statements meaningless. That is the leverage. That is the standard. That is the principle by which authority must be measured. A low murmur ran through the room. The executives whispered among themselves, each calculating the potential fallout. Charles watched silently, calm, unwavering. The clock ticked toward the moment when their next move would either demonstrate accountability or amplify the consequences. Finally, Charles closed the folder, snapping it shut gently, the sound echoing like punctuation. Decide. Act. And do not underestimate the inevitability of accountability. The window for discretion is closing. Every action will now be evaluated against the standard you have allowed to falter for too long. The room was silent. No one spoke. The weight of responsibility pressed on them, palpable. Charles Whitman, composed, deliberate, and unyielding, had transformed a minor incident into a reckoning. And as the sunlight reflected off the glass walls of the boardroom, it illuminated not just the city below, but the inescapable reality systems fail when authority is unchecked, and men who understand leverage will ensure consequences. The lobby of the airline headquarters felt suddenly smaller. The polished marble floors and high ceilings compressed under the weight of tension. Charles Whitman stood at the threshold, briefcase in hand, his presence commanding more attention than any security detail or protocol ever could. Emily Parker and Margaret Lewis flanked him, silent but alert, their expressions reflecting a mix of anticipation and controlled urgency. Every person in the room sensed that something beyond ordinary procedure was about to unfold. Executives and department heads were seated at a long conference table, faces carefully neutral, but betraying hints of unease. Their conversations halted as Charles approached, each step deliberate, measured, echoing softly against the hardwood. The lead executive, mid-40s, smiled politely, an attempt to project authority. The smile did not reach his eyes. He had prepared for a complaint, a minor confrontation, perhaps an apology, not for what was coming. "Good morning," Charles said, his voice low, precise, carrying the weight of accumulated experience. "Let's dispense with pretense. We are not here to exchange niceties. We are here because of failure, a failure of judgment, oversight, and accountability. That failure begins with what occurred on Flight 329 and extends far beyond a single crew or a single incident." A slight shiver passed through the room. The operations director cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitman, we've reviewed your materials. We understand the severity." "Severity," Charles interrupted, leaning slightly forward. "Do not reduce this to severity. Severity implies incidental, marginal, or unfortunate circumstances. This was deliberate, systemic, preventable, and now undeniable." He opened his briefcase and laid out the evidence. Documents, time-stamps, internal communications video, stills, witness statements, each meticulously organized. Emily tapped a tablet, displaying cross-referenced charts, patterns of previous complaints and deviations from policy. Margaret, calm and authoritative, added annotations highlighting repeated failures and systemic gaps. The executives shifted in their seats, each realizing the scope of what they had underestimated. They had thought they faced a passenger grievance. They were instead confronting months of documentation, pattern recognition, and strategic orchestration by a man who had learned to turn injustice into leverage. "Every action taken by your staff," Charles said, voice even but sharp, was a choice enabled by policy gaps and lack of accountability. That choice has consequences, not for me personally, but for your institution, your reputation, and every passenger who has been subjected to similar treatment without recourse. The regional manager attempted a response. "We are prepared to implement disciplinary measures and review procedures." Charles's eyes locked onto him. Disciplinary measures without verification are meaningless. A review without independent oversight is insufficient. If you implement half measures, you signal that authority exists to protect privilege, not fairness. Every hesitation, every attempt to delay will be noted and published. The head of corporate compliance shifted in her chair, clearly unnerved. "And the documentation you've provided? It's comprehensive, beyond what we expected." "Yes," Charles said. "Comprehensive, precise, and undeniable. The public regulators and oversight bodies will have access. The question is whether you act before exposure or wait for escalation that you cannot control." He gestured to Emily. The tablet displayed passenger reports corroborating statements from independent witnesses who had captured the incident on video. Screenshots of communications between staff and dispatch were lined alongside company policy. Every anomaly, every procedural lapse, every deliberate misrepresentation meticulously traced. Margaret spoke next. "You will not be able to argue ignorance. The evidence is complete, verifiable, and strategically compiled. Any attempt to minimize, delay, or obfuscate will be evident to every regulator and media outlet you attempt to brief." Charles allowed the words to sink. The executives leaned forward, some unconsciously. Others stiffened. Each realized that what they had dismissed as a minor complaint had evolved into an exposure they could neither ignore nor control. The lead executive swallowed. "If we comply with your requests, will this remain internal?" Charles tilted his head, letting a slow smile form, faint but deliberate. "Internal containment is a choice, not a guarantee. When wrongdoing is systemic documented and witnessed truth emerges, you may choose transparency and accountability now and guide the narrative or delay, and allow it to define you. That is the decision." A junior analyst whispered to a colleague. Margaret caught the subtle exchange and nodded imperceptibly. Observers were ready, recording every nuance, every hesitation, every facial expression. Every microsecond of uncertainty would be evidence in itself. Charles stood and moved slowly to the window, looking out over the city's expanse. Streets glimmered like veins, cars moving in precise yet chaotic patterns. He turned back, letting his presence fill the room. "Understand this," he said. Voice measured, controlled, unwavering. "This is not about me. It is about the system you maintain. It is about whether authority is exercised responsibly. It is about whether fairness can survive in an institution built on hierarchy and procedure." He opened the folder again, tapping lightly on a page with a finger. "You are accountable, individually, collectively, and institutionally. Any action short of full accountability will be treated as complicity. The narrative will be public, the consequences immediate, and the documentation unassailable." The room was silent. The hum of the city outside, distant, irrelevant. Every executive understood the threshold had been crossed. They could no longer claim ignorance, oversight, or unintended error. Emily tapped her tablet, bringing up a prepared communication strategy for every potential scenario: denial, partial acknowledgement, full compliance. Each script linked to evidence witness statements and timelines. The room's tension thickened. They could see the precision of planning, the inevitability of consequence. Margaret leaned forward slightly. They will resist. They always do. Fear is their first reaction. But fear is predictable, and predictable is manageable. Charles's gaze swept across the room. Exactly. Anticipate hesitation. Observe reaction. Apply pressure where leverage is greatest. The timing must be perfect. The actions cannot be delayed. And every observer, every participant, will record and verify that you acted or failed to act as expected. The regional manager exhaled sharply, glancing at colleagues. Charles lifted a hand. No explanations, no rationalizations, decisions only. And they must align with accountability, transparency, and consequence. Anything less will be exposure, and you will be measured against it publicly. That is the power of documented truth, and it is now in your hands, whether you embrace it or ignore it. The executives exchanged glances, the weight of inevitability pressing against them. The assistant quietly adjusted the tablet, ensuring every document and piece of evidence was accessible. The gravity of the situation settled like a physical presence, pressing down, demanding acknowledgement. Charles allowed a brief pause, letting the tension stretch, letting the certainty of his position sink in. Then he spoke again. Prepare your responses. Prepare your compliance measures. Prepare for transparency. And understand this delay, evasion, or obfuscation will not protect you. It will only magnify the consequences. He closed the folder with a sharp snap. The sound echoed in the room like a gavel striking a table. The message was unmistakable. He had transformed patience into strategy, indignity into leverage, observation into action. The executives sat frozen, absorbing the magnitude. This was no longer a minor incident. This was systemic accountability in motion, precise and unstoppable. And Charles Whitman, calm, composed, unyielding, had ensured that the first moves had already been made long before they realized they were in play. Outside, the city lights continued to blink indifferent. Inside, a reckoning was unfolding, deliberate, measured, and inevitable. The pattern was set, the precedent established, and the world, or at least the industry, would soon take notice. Charles Whitman stood in the glass-walled conference room. The city stretched out beneath him, a lattice of light and motion that felt both distant and inconsequential. He did not sit. He never sat when stakes were this high. Every inch of him radiated control, authority, and deliberate precision. Emily Parker had set up the evidence across the table, a cascade of documents, video stills, flight logs, and witness statements. Margaret Lewis observed quietly from the corner, her presence a calm counterweight to the tense energy in the room. The airline's board members entered one by one, carefully neutral expressions in place, but subtle signs of tension betrayed them. The CEO of the parent company, a man in his early 60s with a meticulously pressed suit, nodded politely. "Mr. Whitman," he began, voice measured, "we understand the nature of your concerns. We've reviewed preliminary materials. Let's discuss how to proceed." Charles did not acknowledge the courtesy. He let the words linger like a pause, pregnant with consequence. "Discuss," he said. "There is nothing to discuss in abstract terms. What occurred on Flight 329 was deliberate, and your actions since then have compounded the failure. I am here to ensure accountability, transparency, and consequence, not polite negotiation." A murmur ran through the boardroom. Some shifted in their seats. Others tightened grips on the table. Every executive understood, at least intellectually, that this was no ordinary complaint. This was a test of integrity, of decision-making, under exposure, and of their willingness to confront institutional failure. The lead flight operations officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we are prepared to take action, disciplinary measures, internal review, retraining programs." Charles's gaze sliced through him. Disciplinary measures without verification are meaningless. Retraining without enforcement is performative. You have allowed repeated failures to occur. Half measures signal that authority exists to protect reputation, not fairness. That is unacceptable. Margaret stepped forward, voice precise. "The documentation Mr. Whitman has compiled is comprehensive. Timestamps, video statements, prior complaints, and internal communications. Every misstep is corroborated. Any attempt to minimize or misrepresent the facts will be immediately evident." The youngest board member, barely 35, whispered something to his neighbor, eyebrows raised. Emily caught it and nodded subtly. Observers and witnesses were now silently recording every reaction. Every flicker of hesitation would be evidence. Charles picked up a folder, tapping it lightly against the table. "Your employees made deliberate choices. Your systems enabled those choices, and you have the responsibility to correct not just the isolated incident, but the conditions that allowed it to persist." The CEO exhaled through his nose, attempting calm. "And what are your expectations, Mr. Whitman?" "We want to resolve this responsibly." Charles let the words hang for a moment, then leaned forward, voice deliberate, precise. "Immediate accountability for the staff involved. Not temporary suspension. Immediate. A full independent review of the operational procedures that allowed such behavior. Transparency in reporting and corrective action. Compensation for affected passengers. Public acknowledgement of the failures. And independent oversight to prevent recurrence. Anything less is insufficient." A low ripple of shock passed through the room. They had assumed a complaint, a minor incident, a quiet resolution. Not this. Not a meticulously documented, comprehensive assessment of systemic failure paired with an exacting list of remedies. The regional manager leaned forward, voice tight. "This is unprecedented. The scope we weren't prepared for, such." Charles cut him off smoothly. "Preparation is irrelevant. Execution is everything. You had the opportunity to prevent failure. You did not. You now have the opportunity to restore integrity. Choose carefully." Emily tapped her tablet. Charts appeared, showing patterns, repeated deviations from policy historical complaints, inconsistencies in enforcement. Margaret highlighted certain communications, each underlined in red. "The evidence cannot be ignored," she said. "Any attempt to do so is a decision to accept accountability or failure publicly." The boardroom shifted. Some executive eyes darted to one another. The CEO's jaw tightened. He had thought the situation would be routine, easily contained. He had not accounted for Charles Whitman's preparation, patience, and strategic foresight. Charles did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His calm, deliberate authority filled the room, demanding acknowledgement. "Understand this, he said. Every hesitation, every obfuscation, every misstatement from this point forward will be recorded, verified, and interpreted. Compliance is your choice. Delay, denial, or minimization is public exposure. The decision is yours, and it will have consequences. Margaret's voice cut softly, firmly. The public regulators and civil rights organizations have been briefed. They will verify compliance. There is no room for ambiguity. The CFO swallowed. The financial implications are significant. Immediate action will impact operations morale and investor confidence. Charles allowed a faint nod. And inaction will cost more. Reputation market, trust, regulatory oversight, media attention. Every delay, every excuse amplifies the impact. That is the calculus. Action now with integrity reduces exposure. Delay, denial, or avoidance increases it exponentially. The operations director tried again. We could start with partial measures to mitigate exposure. Charles's eyes cut to him like a laser. Partial measures are meaningless. You either act fully and transparently, or the system will act on your behalf. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every timestamp is irrefutable. Half measures will be interpreted as admission of complicity. The boardroom went silent. Even the air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. Every executive understood the window for maneuvering had closed. The man before them, patient, calm, unyielding, had calculated leverage, exposure, and consequence in a way no one else had anticipated. Emily tapped her tablet, bringing up a timeline of correspondence between corporate staff and flight operations. Charles gestured. This timeline shows repeated failures, not errors, but decisions. Every incident compounded by inadequate oversight. Every ignored complaint demonstrates systemic weakness. Your responsibility is not just to correct one instance, but to correct the conditions that allowed it to persist. And you will. Or you will be defined by it. Margaret's eyes swept the room. Any statements you make internally or externally will be verified against this documentation. There will be no evasion, no ambiguity. Compliance must be complete, verifiable, and transparent. The youngest board member whispered again, this time audible. This is bigger than anything I've ever seen. Charles allowed a faint smile. Yes, it is bigger, because it is about more than a meal, more than a flight, more than personnel. It is about whether systems designed to serve people can be trusted to uphold fairness, and whether authority will act when challenged. A pause. Then the CEO spoke, voice tight. Mr. Whitman, if we act as you request, can the situation be contained internally? Charles's gaze swept the room, slow and deliberate. Containment is a choice. But truth, once documented and verified, cannot be contained. You may act with integrity and guide the narrative or delay, and allow it to control you. Every hesitation will be noted, every misstep amplified. The choice is yours. The executives leaned back, absorbed, each measuring the scope, the risk, the potential fallout. Every micro-expression, every blink, every subtle hesitation was now visible, recorded mentally and digitally. They were no longer in control. The narrative had shifted irrevocably. Charles closed the folder with a definitive snap. The sound echoed in the room, not loud but resonant. Decide. Act. Accountability begins now. The moment you delay is the moment you abdicate responsibility, and the consequences will follow. Silence fell heavy, dense in the conference room. The city beyond continued its indifferent pulse. Inside, one man had transformed patience into strategy, indignity into leverage, observation into execution. The consequences were set in motion, precise and unavoidable. And Charles Whitman, calm, deliberate, and unyielding, would see it through. The morning air in Los Angeles was crisp, filtered through the haze of the city that never truly slept. Charles Whitman stepped out of the car, briefcase in hand, and felt the weight of the last 24 hours settle into his shoulders. The building before him, gleaming glass and steel, reflected both the rising sun and the magnitude of what was about to occur inside. He did not rush. He never rushed. Every step, every motion was deliberate, measured, a signal of command before any words were spoken. Inside the boardroom was already charged with a tension that could be felt in the air like static before a storm. The airline executives had assembled their faces masks of professionalism, hiding uncertainty, apprehension, and the faint traces of panic. They had spent the night reviewing documents, recalculating risk, rehearsing statements. But none of it had prepared them for the man who now stood in the doorway, calm, unyielding, every inch of him, projecting authority. Charles set his briefcase on the table and opened it slowly, as if to give the room a moment to absorb the inevitability. He did not speak at first. He let the silence stretch thick and heavy until it pressed against the walls, the floor, the eyes of everyone present. Then he spoke, voice low, precise, each syllable deliberate. We are here to resolve a systemic failure, not as a favor, not as negotiation, but as the minimal requirement of accountability. You have had time to prepare. You have chosen how to respond. Now it is action that will determine outcome. The CEO of the airline, a man with graying hair and a carefully tailored suit, cleared his throat. Mr. Whitman, we've reviewed the materials. We understand the seriousness. Charles held up a hand, cutting him off. Understanding is insufficient. Recognition is insufficient. You are here to act, to implement measures that are enforceable, transparent, and verifiable. Anything less will be interpreted as abdication of responsibility. Margaret Lewis stepped forward, placing a hand on the folder of evidence. We have verified everything. Every statement, every video, every communication. There is no ambiguity. Any misrepresentation from this point will be publicly documented and disseminated. A murmur ran through the room. The executives exchanged glances, realizing the gravity of the situation. This was no longer about a single flight, a single crew, or even a single complaint. This was about systemic accountability exposure, and the demonstration that authority without oversight is meaningless. Charles leaned forward slightly, letting the weight of his presence fill the room. Immediate discipline for the employees involved. Independent review of operational systems. Transparent reporting. Compensation for affected passengers. Public acknowledgement. Oversight. These are the minimum measures necessary to begin restoration of integrity. Anything less is insufficient and will be treated as further failure. The operations director exhaled, hands gripping the edge of the table. Mr. Whitman, The scale of these actions is significant. It will require coordination, resources, time. Charles's gaze cut to him, steady and unflinching. Correct. And the scale reflects the magnitude of your failures. Accountability is never small. You can choose to implement these measures now in full, or allow the exposure to define the narrative for you. That is the only choice you have left. Emily tapped her tablet, bringing up timelines, witness statements, and communications, each cross-referenced and aligned. Margaret pointed to a chart showing previous incidents that had been ignored, patterns, repeated complaints minimized. Every previous failure is now visible, she said. The moment you attempt to downplay this, the narrative becomes clear. It will be public, verifiable, and irreversible. The CEO leaned back, running a hand through his hair, his composure fraying. Mr. Whitman is their room for negotiation. Adjustments. Charles allowed a faint, controlled smile. Adjustments are meaningless when the issue is systemic. Half measures will be treated as admission of complicity. Timing and action matter. The public regulators and oversight bodies will know exactly what was done and what was avoided. You cannot obscure the truth now. One of the younger board members shifted nervously. This is unprecedented. The documentation, the preparation. Charles nodded once. Yes. That is precisely why it is effective. Systems that fail repeatedly must be confronted with evidence, strategy, and consequences, not words, not apologies, action. Margaret added softly, every action taken or delayed from this point forward will be recorded and verified. There is no hiding. There is no escape from accountability. The operations director swallowed, glancing at the other executives. The magnitude of the situation settled into the room like a physical weight. Decisions could no longer be deferred, and inaction was itself a declaration. Charles picked up the folder, tapping lightly against it. Let this be clear. Compliance is now measured against integrity and transparency. Any evasion, delay, or misrepresentation will be treated as further failure. You will either meet the standard or be defined by your inability to act. The CEO exhaled sharply. We will comply. Charles allowed the words to linger. Comply fully, transparently, and immediately. That is the only acceptable response. Anything less will be exposed, and the consequences will follow. The staff involved will be disciplined without delay. Systems will be audited. Compensation mechanisms will be established. Oversight will be independent. And you will report publicly verifiable quarterly on all progress. No excuses. No exceptions. A quiet shiver ran through the room. Every executive understood that they were no longer in control. The narrative, the evidence, and the expectations had shifted entirely. Charles had transformed patience into strategy, indignity into leverage, and documentation into power. Emily tapped the tablet again. We have verified media contacts and civil rights organizations. They are standing by to validate transparency and enforcement. Charles nodded. Good. Let the record show that action is deliberate, measured, and unassailable. Timing is essential. The narrative is under control only because it is aligned with evidence, witnesses, and strategy. Any deviation will be public. Margaret added. And the affected passengers have been briefed and are prepared to participate. Every aspect is verifiable. Charles looked out the window at the city below, lights flickering, roads winding, people moving in oblivion. This is not about revenge. This is not about spectacle. This is about principle. Authority carries responsibility. Privilege carries obligation. And failure to act has consequences. The boardroom remained silent. Every person present understood that this was more than a flight or a denied meal. It was a test of integrity and governance, a demonstration that systems could no longer operate unchecked. Charles closed the folder with a definitive snap, a punctuation that echoed in the quiet room. Decide, act, and understand that the window for evasion has closed. Accountability begins now. Every hesitation, every misrepresentation, every attempt to minimize the failure will be public documented and unassailable. Compliance, transparency, and consequence are no longer optional. The executives absorbed the weight of the statement. The room, once confident, now felt constrained by the inevitability of action. Charles Whitman, calm, deliberate, unyielding, had transformed the incident from a single complaint into systemic reckoning. Every move, every decision, every moment would now be measured against the standard he had set. Outside the building, the city continued its indifferent pulse. Inside, accountability was no longer abstract. It was immediate, deliberate, and irreversible. The moment had arrived, and the consequences, long prepared and meticulously calculated, were about to unfold. Charles allowed a faint nod to Emily and Margaret, signaling the transition from preparation to execution. Everything was in place. The board, the executives, the documentation, the witnesses, the media channels, all aligned. The plan would unfold as designed. He straightened his jacket, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, and exhaled slowly. The storm he had orchestrated would move precisely as he intended, and the first consequences would be felt before the day was over. The airline, its staff, and its executives had entered a new reality, one where accountability could not be delayed, ignored, or diminished. The room remained quiet, the hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic outside the only sounds. Charles Whitman, deliberate, composed, and unyielding, stood as the fulcrum of justice in motion, and as he finally turned toward the executive's voice, calm but commanding, he said, "Begin, like, subscribe, comment now."